Well, good morning. Thanks so much for choosing to spend part of your Sunday morning with us. We're just grateful for the opportunity to be here together with you, that you would choose to carve some time and some space out of your lives to spend it here. That means a lot to us, so thanks so much for being here. As most of you guys know, we are in the middle of this really long series of messages called The Jesus Project. We are pushing into year 3 almost. We're almost there. And then, as I've said over the last few weeks, we've got about a year to spend in the last week of Jesus' life trying to see everything that he said and did in that last really significant week of his life, where so much of everything that he was about kind of comes to its culmination. And so we're in John's Gospel, and we're going to be in John's Gospel for the next few weeks together, dealing with some of the stories that John tells, which are unique from the ones that Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell. And so we've got a lot of material in John's gospel that isn't found in the other gospels. And I've said, along the way that John is sort of the problem child of the gospels when it comes to the timeline in this whole project. And he's also very unique in the fact that his stories and the way he tells the stories tend to be a lot more expansive. There's a lot that goes on inside of the John stories. And so last week we told the story of the man who had been born blind that Jesus heals. And then I left you in the middle of the story last week, in the middle of John chapter 9. And we're going to pick up and we're going to finish off the story of what happens after that moment and the conversations that happen around that man's experience and that man's life. And I've said before, a lot of you guys know, I grew up in church, and my parents were not necessarily super religious people before, the time that my siblings and I started to come along. And you guys know that sometimes this is what happens, that children sort of create a crisis in a good way, sometimes in a bad way, but they create a crisis for you in the sense of what are we going to do with these kids? What are we going to do with our lives? And my parents, my dad grew up Catholic, my mom grew up, I think it was Lutheran, and neither of them really were practicing much of their faith, as they went through the 60s and early 70s, let's just say. There was a lot of life that was being lived that was not really church-focused in the 60s and 70s. And I didn't, obviously I didn't know my parents at that time and at that stage of life. I just knew the Jesus-following version of my parents that was very straight-laced, and, we didn't listen to any secular music, and we didn't have alcohol in the house, and there was just, it was just a very straight-laced kind of experience growing up. And at some point, I don't remember exactly how old I was, but our youth pastor at my little church that I grew up in invited my dad to come and share his story to the youth group and share his before and after Jesus story. And I sat there as whatever it was, let's say I was 15 years old. I sat there as a 15-year-old kid thinking, no way. My dad made marijuana brownies. My dad, I wouldn't have thought of stepping a toe out of line in front of my father. My dad was a deacon. He preached on Sunday nights. Everything about his life was focused on Jesus. Everything that I knew about him was focused on his experience and his relationship with Jesus. And there I am sitting there listening to my father tell these stories about the way that he used to live his life before he had come to Jesus. It was an eye-opening experience, and I don't think until I was writing this message, I really understood how much courage it took for my dad to stand there in front of his own children and other kids inside of his church community who only knew Deacon Brother Bert, and to say that he had a before Jesus life that didn't really match up with the after Jesus life that we all knew about him. And I remember just having my mind blown by this experience and thinking, again, now looking back on it, the courage that it took for him to stand there in front of that group of people and say, this is what my life was. And the thing that I remember about my dad, I told myself, don't get emotional, and it didn't work. I remember a lot of things about him. One of the most distinct things that I will always remember is he knew things about Jesus that could not be explained in an intellectual, sort of academic way. He knew what his life had been before he met Jesus. And he knew what his life was after he met Jesus. And he had this distinct and remarkable kind of faith that didn't come from someone having explained Jesus intellectually to him, but it came from him having experienced a remarkable transformation in his life that couldn't, in his mind, couldn't have been explained any other way other than to say that he had met Jesus. And because he had met Jesus, everything about his life was different. Everything about his life had changed from the moment that he recognized that Jesus had come not just to, sort of be the Catholic Jesus on the cross Jesus. He had come to be the Jesus that was meeting him where he was in the depths of his sin and brokenness, rescuing him out of that and placing him in a new way of living his life, taking him out of what he knew was the kingdom of darkness and bringing him into what he knew was the kingdom of light and life and hope and future for him. So everything about his life generated from this remarkable experience. And I remember hearing my dad, and I knew he had, not followed Jesus his whole life, but I remember hearing my dad tell his story and thinking, there's something valuable and unique about that experience that you can't replicate, that you can't, again, intellectualize, and you can't kind of find your way into. It's like it has to happen in such a unique and personal way for him. And the story that we told last week was a story of a person who has a very distinct before and after Jesus story. He's got a moment, and he's got actually not just a moment, he's got an entire lifetime of living his life in blindness. And Jesus comes along, sees him there, says, I'm going to heal you today, spits in the ground, makes mud out of the saliva, puts it on his eyes, says, go and wash in the pool. The man goes and washes in the pool, and then the way John tells the story, and he went home seeing. And from that moment forward, you can imagine that everything in his life, just like my dad had that moment, everything in his life was different from that point forward because he had this unique and distinct experience with Jesus that could not be replicated by anything else and by anyone else in his life. And so we talked about last week the way that experience sort of starts to ripple out. His neighbors and his friends are like, is this the same guy that we know? And he says, it's me. I'm the guy. I was born blind. They bring him to the Pharisees and the religious leaders, and the religious leaders and Pharisees start having these conversations, these very theoretical conversations. And some people, and we talked about this last week, have settled what they believe about Jesus. And so because they've settled what they believe, they're not open to hearing the man's story. They're not open to hearing him say, I was born blind and now I see. And then there's this other group of Pharisees that are open and saying, well, if you guys think this guy is such a sinful man and you think he's really like this Sabbath-breaking, terrible guy, then how do we explain this blind man who's standing in front of us, who was blind and is now seeing? And then they brought his parents in and they said, hey, is this your son? Was he born blind? Can you tell us how this happened? And the parents, sort of do the evasive thing. Well, why don't you just ask him? Don't ask us. We don't put us in the middle of this because we know you've already decided what you think about Jesus. And if we tell you something that contradicts what you think about Jesus, you're going to throw us into a difficult position. We don't want to put ourselves there. Go ahead and ask him. He is of age. He can speak for himself. And so here's where we pick up the story in John chapter 9, verse 24. It says, so for the second time, they called the man who had been born blind, and they said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. You see that again. It's a statement. We know who this guy is. We know that this man is a sinner. And he answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. That's above my pay grade. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. That's it. One thing I know, In this second interview, the Pharisees bring him back and they say, okay, let's try a different approach. Give glory to God. And what they're saying to the blind man, the man who had been born blind, who now sees, is we recognize that something extraordinary has happened to you. And we recognize that the only person who could do something this extraordinary is God himself. And so why don't, instead of giving glory and credit to this Jesus guy, why don't you give glory and give credit to God, who's obviously done something extraordinary in your life? And let's leave the Jesus guy behind and let's focus on the great thing that's happened to you that God has done for you. Because we know that Jesus can't be from God. We've already decided this. We've sort of closed our minds. We've got our experience. We've got our knowledge. We've got our intellect. We've got all of these things that tell us that this person who comes and heals people on the Sabbath day, he can't be from God. We don't really kind of jive with that. We know he's a sinner. We've decided. So instead of giving credit to a sinner, give credit to God. And the man, again, I think this second part is a little bit more contentious, right? The first time he's maybe a little bit more open. I think the second time around, he's like, listen, I've told you my story. And I know you're trying to get me off the story. I know you're trying to kind of intellectualize this. I know you're trying to push this away. I know you're trying to make this about something that you think it's not. But I just want you to know there's not a lot of things I know, right? Like I'm not claiming to have perfect knowledge about this guy's background. I don't know where he came from. I don't know what he's been doing up until this moment. I can't tell you a theological treatise about, whether or not this guy is a good guy or not. But what I know is my experience. What I know is what I've lived. What I know is what happened to me is I was blind for my entire life, and Jesus came along, and once he came along, put the mud on my eyes, then I went home seeing, and my life is never going to be the same again because I met with Jesus. He knows experientially what they can't know intellectually, right? Like they're trying to, again, piece all of the puzzle together, trying to make sure, all right, like how do we fit this together? If this Jesus guy is really from God or not, then what's he doing on the Sabbath healing people? What's he doing with all these crazy things? Why is he hanging out with all of these sinful people? Why does he do all of these things that seem to not fit our understanding of who a Messiah could or should be? Why is he doing all of this stuff? And what I love about this guy is that he says, I don't need to know all of that. I don't need to know all that. You guys can debate that all you want. You have all the academic discussions that you want. I'm just going to tell you what I know. And the one thing that I know is what I've experienced. I was blind. I met Jesus, and now I see. And there's something, right, really powerful about a man who's willing to stand in front of a group of people who are trying to knock him off of his story and say, you do all the, pushing, pulling, all the back and forth. We can do this all day, but I'm just going to tell you, you're not going to change what I know is true because what I've experienced has changed and shaped my life forever. And you guys can do whatever you want with it. But I'm going to keep going back to, and you can call me back as many times as you want, and the story is never going to change, right? I was blind, and now I see. And so they said to him, well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, and here's again where I think you start to see some of the frustration with the man who had been born blind. I've told you already, and you wouldn't listen. What, do you want to hear it again? Maybe this is just my way of reading it. Like, what do I need to tell you again? I've told you once. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples? Now he's poking the bear. Now he's pushing the buttons. Now he's kind of, getting a little nudgy there. And they reviled him, saying, you're his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken through Moses. But as for this man, we do not know where he even comes from. And the man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. And I love this because sarcasm is kind of my second language. This is amazing. You group of scholars, wise, biblical knowledge people, you don't know where he comes from, and you're so hung up on that, and yet, the one thing that's looking you right in the face, you refuse to see. And yet, he opened my eyes. We know that God, now he's teaching them. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. And so never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. So if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. Now, right, like this is, as the second interview comes to a close, this is how it lands. The man answers, you guys are all hung up on this. Where does he come from and how did he open my eyes? I'm not so worried about that. I don't need to know where he came from. I don't need to know his background. I don't need to know his genealogy. I don't need to know the origin story. I don't need to know any of that. If you guys want to figure out where he came from, go ahead, have at it. What I know is what you have already said. If this man was such a sinner, he couldn't do the kinds of things that he's doing and the thing that I experienced for myself. If this man isn't from God, then explain my opened eyes. Or like if this man isn't from God, then explain away my experience. Then change my mind. Tell me how it is that a person who you say is a sinner, you don't know where he comes from, and you don't know how he got here, and you don't know what he's doing and how he's doing the things that he's doing, and whether or not he's doing them from God or from Satan himself, which you guys have said before. But I know that if he's not from God, then there's nothing he could do. And there's caught up on this Moses thing, and they say, well, we know Moses. We know Moses. We know Moses' credentials. We know Moses was sent from God, and we are disciples of Moses. And as for you sinful guy here who's trying to make a case for Jesus, we don't know this Jesus. We don't know where he comes from, and we don't know what his experience is, and we don't know what his background is, and we don't know his credentials. We can't see his certificate that says, he's sent from God. And they know the only thing that they can know, which is they know Moses. They're like, okay, we'll stand with Moses. Moses said, don't do these things on the Sabbath, which he didn't really say, but that was their interpretation of what Moses had said. Right, like Moses never said, and you can look through the Old Testament. Moses never said, don't heal blind people on the Sabbath day. He didn't. That was their interpretation of it. Moses never said if, some paralyzed guy gets dropped down through the roof in front of you in the house that you're teaching at, you can't heal him. You got to tell him to come back the next day and then you can heal. Moses never said that. They know Moses, and they don't even know Moses as well as they think they know Moses. But he knows Jesus. And he says, what I have experienced has changed the course and direction of my life. You can have Moses. I'll take him. I'll take him. You can have all of the theory. You can have all of the notes. You can have all of the background. You can have all of the information. And I think it's all important. I'm not saying you shouldn't pay attention to any of that stuff. I don't think he was saying that. But at the end of the day, something personal shifted for him. And he felt that Jesus had changed the course and direction of his life. And they looked at him, the religious leaders, and they said, you don't belong with us. They literally, when it says they cast him out, they made him an outcast in his synagogue. They said, you don't belong to us anymore. You're not part of us. We're over here and you're over there. You go your way and we're going to go ours. And Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. This is a really significant moment inside of John's gospel. As Jesus goes to find the man that they cast out, and they said, you don't belong in our synagogue anymore. And he looks at the man who's been born blind, and he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you believe in the one that God is sending with all power and with all authority? Do you believe in the one that's coming, that when he comes, his coming will indicate that the kingdom of God has come among us? Do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man says, well, I would believe in him if you would just tell me who he is. And Jesus looks and says, you've seen him. Now, again, that's a significant statement, right? Because this is a guy who hasn't ever seen anything in his entire life until this moment. You have seen him. And I think John, again, he's like working on both levels here, right? Like you've seen him with your eyes, and that's something that you've never seen before. But you've also shown a remarkable ability to see him clearly. You also, even before, all of this stuff happened, you had the ability to perceive that when Jesus showed up, there was someone significant that had stepped into your life and had come into your life in that moment. You saw what all of the other people around you were not seeing, what the Pharisees haven't seen, with all of their academia, with all of their intellect, all of their knowledge, all of their understanding of Moses and the law and the prophets and all of that sort of stuff. You, blind man, you have seen him. You opened your eyes before your eyes were even opened. And when you saw him, you believed. And he said, I believe. Lord, I believe. And then he got down and he worshiped him. And this is, again, sometimes I've as I was reading through this and, sort of different objections that happen, when we talk about who Jesus is, people will say that this phrase that he worshiped him was a word that was used to describe just giving honor and reverence to a person of great significance and great worth. It's not ever used that way in John's gospel. Every time John uses this word, he's talking about the kind of worship that only belongs to God. And so this man who's been born blind experiences a moment with Jesus that changes and transforms his life. And his response in the conversation with Jesus, do you believe in the Son of Man? He says, I believe, and then he decides to do something that's completely and utterly against everything that anyone would say he should do. He worships Jesus as you would worship God. Because I think, and again, this is what John has been saying, and I think this is what the other gospel writers have been saying, right? Like if Jesus is doing the things that Jesus is doing, then he is doing the things that only God can do. That the things that Jesus does are the things that only God can do, and the people who are experiencing them are recognizing that only God can do the things that Jesus is doing. And so this man, in his experience, in his moment, he says, I believe and I will worship you as God. I will give to you what belongs only to God, to a person standing in front of him. And for him, seeing Jesus clearly leads to worship. Seeing Jesus clearly. Not just with his physical eyes, right? But with his actual spiritual eyes. Leads him to a place where he's willing to worship Jesus. And Jesus doesn't say, don't do that. He doesn't say, no, don't, that's only for God. He receives this worship from this man who's been formerly blind and now sees, directed towards him. And then he says this, for judgment I came into the world, so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. And some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, are we also blind? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, we see, your guilt remains. And Jesus puts his finger on this thing. He says, I came, and we've talked about this, I came to mediate a crisis for you. I came to bring you to a point of decision. I came to bring you to a place where you've got to decide what you think and what you believe. And you say, we see. You say, we see everything clearly. We know Moses, we're Moses' disciples. We see the scripture, we see the law, we see the prophets. We see that you are a sinful man. And he says, because you claim to see, I'm telling you, you've actually blinded yourselves. Your open-mindedness, right? Like all of this, we want to be open-minded. We got to, you have closed down your vision to what you could and should see right in front of you. And now that you say, we see, I'm telling you, you actually don't see. And I'm telling you that I came so that the people who say that they don't see would see. So that people who say that we're not the smartest people in the room, we're not the people who have everything figured out. We're the people who have experienced something that has shifted and changed and altered the course of our lives. And, you can talk about it all you want. But at the end of the day, the blind see. And when the blind see, they look at Jesus and they worship. And Jesus said, I came to bring this to a conclusion for you, to a point where you have to decide. He says, I came so that the blind would see, and so that the sighted, the ones who have sight, become blind. The ones who claim to have, I've got a bead on God. Those are the ones, Jesus says, who actually don't see very well. The blind see, the ones with sight become blind. Jesus changes the course and direction of people's lives when he shows up on the scene. And one of the things that I think is so important and so significant, and the way we set up this series, right, and I think it's important, we're doing a lot of context. I'm trying to give you as much background, I'm trying to give you as much information as we possibly can, because I think that that's important. And I think the gospel writers wrote their stories so that we could have a clear picture of who Jesus is, the things that he said and the things that he did. But all four of the gospel writers, with all of their differences and all of the distinctions and all the unique things about them, I know that all four of the gospel writers wrote their stories so that at some point or another, you and I would experience something personal to us. They want to move us beyond the place where we just sort of take this as an academic, intellectual exercise and we kind of put all the pieces and all the context and all the information into place. And at some point or another, they wrote their stories to mediate for us a personal crisis, a personal experience with Jesus that could change the course and direction of our lives. John actually is the clearest of them at the end of his gospel. He says, I wrote all of these things just so that you would believe, just so that you would have the same kind of experience that this man who's been born blind experienced for himself. I wrote everything down, including the story of this man who had been born blind and his interaction with the Pharisees and all the stuff that happened around that. And I wrote the story of him standing there in the middle of that group, standing on his story. I wrote that so that you guys could have the same experience for yourselves. We are telling these stories, and I don't really make any apology for this. We're telling these stories about Jesus so that at some point or another, you have your own personal experience with Jesus. Because here's what I believe. I firmly believe. I'm not good enough as a preacher to convince you to believe in Jesus. There have been some really, really brilliant preachers, way smarter than me, way more gifted intellectually than me, way more eloquent than me. You've probably heard some of them. In fact, you have access to them. There's literally thousands of them across the world. You can have podcasts from dozens of different people. None of us are good enough to convince you about who Jesus is. The only thing that we can do is what the gospel writers did and what we're trying to do in this series is say, here's Jesus. And what I believe is he's enough to change the course and direction of your life. I'm not enough. No preacher, no matter how good, gifted, talented, eloquent, and powerful they are, no preacher, no pastor, no teacher is good enough to change your mind. At some point or another, you have your own experience with Jesus. And when you do, I don't know when that comes for some of you it's already happened, some of you it's still in the future. When you do, I don't think anything in the world is going to argue you out of your experience. I don't think anything in the world or anyone, gifted, powerful, intellectual in the world, is going to be able to convince you that what happened to you didn't happen to you. And so here's the thing. If you find yourself and you say, well, I've had my Jesus experience. I've had my story. My life has been changed and my life has been transformed. Then here's what I want to remind you from this story. I want you to tell your story, and I want you to tell it often. And there's something about you as an individual saying, this is my life. I will, again, and I know it's obviously super personal to me because it was my dad, but there was nothing that impacted me and my own faith and my own relationship with Jesus as much as hearing my father in his own words tell his story. Say, this is who I was and this is who I am, and the difference is I met Jesus. You can argue and you can intellectualize and you can put all the pieces and all the information together. And again, I think it's important. I think it's significant enough that we're taking 3 years out of our life as a church to do it. But what I know, right, is that there's no substitute for you telling your story. There's no substitute for a man who's been born blind standing in front of a group of people saying, I don't know what else you know. I don't know what else I know. But one thing I know, I was blind, and now I see. I was lost, and now I'm found. I was dead, and now I'm alive. And if you can tell that story, then I want to suggest to you, it doesn't matter, and that may be a little too strong. It doesn't matter if you can find all of the verses in the Bible and point to them and say, well, I know this verse, and I know that verse, and I know this one says this about Jesus, and that one says that about Jesus. Again, I'm not trying to minimize that and say that none of that stuff is important. But I will say there's no substitute for a person who has a story and is willing to tell it, and tell it often. I was lost, and now I'm found. I was blind, and now I see. If you have that story, that's enough to stand on for the rest of your life. And if you don't feel like you have that story, then I'm telling you that John is telling us this story to say that could be you. Jesus is inviting you to be changed and transformed in the same way he did for that blind man, same way that he did for people that are sitting in this room, the same way that he did it for my dad on the day that my dad met Jesus. Tell your story. Tell it often. Live it and experience it for yourself. And see the world through that lens. And I guarantee changes, transforms you from that day forward forever. We're going to pray this morning. Jesus, there's just no way to substitute for the experience of having lived life without you and then lived life with you. There's no substitute for us being changed and being transformed and having our own experience with you. And so Jesus, for us who are sitting here this morning, I'm just asking that we would see you as clearly as that blind man saw you that day. Not just our eyes on the things that you did and said, but the eyes of our hearts being opened to who you really are. And so, Jesus, I pray for some of us this morning who are still wrestling through what we think and believe and know to be true about you. I pray for that sort of experience for us, that we would see you clearly with the eyes of our hearts, and that as a result we would have faith, trust awakened inside of us towards you. And for those of us who are on the other side of that and know what we know, I pray that we would never get tired of telling a story of having been blind and having come to see, having met you in a way that changed and transformed our lives forever. May we tell it as often as we possibly can, as powerfully as we can, in order to let people around us know this is the one who changes us. You, Jesus, you are the one who changes us. It's in your name that we pray these things. Amen.